Ask the room, does anyone want to confess to being a Yik Yak user when it was still running? Very few. Does anyone know about Yik Yak and has heard of it? Yeah, okay, great. Well, anyway, I'm going to talk about Yik Yak, how and why it died. And then I'm going to move on from there to think about why we should care about the death of Yik Yak, and talking about the different kinds of value, which I think kind of clustered around that particular, not that particular application, but what that application did for and with our university students. Then I'm going to draw two conclusions, which I won't reveal now because it would spoil it. Okay, so to start with, I'm going to talk about the life and the slow death of Yik Yak. And for those that aren't aware of Yik Yak or what it did, it was a geosocial anonymous networking application which launched in 2013. So the way it worked was it enabled people who were close together, in close proximity to each other, to send very short, kind of Twitter-style anonymous messages. So when it was popular, it would only reach within a kind of radius of about a mile or a mile and a half. As it became less popular, it would be drawing yaks in from perhaps a 10-mile radius. It was marketed very heavily on university campuses, initially in the US and then internationally, the UK and Australia in particular. So it was very widely used by particularly undergraduate students on campus. And it became really almost ubiquitous in the US and in the UK. And it was very controversial during the time of its life for its incidents of hate speech and victimization that happened on the Yak. Oh. That's my Siri kicking up. Okay, so here's how it worked. It was hyper-local, so it worked within a very tight radius, and people could interact with each other's yaks within a tight radius of about a mile and a half max. It was community moderated, and this is really important for what I want to talk about later, in that the community determined the popularity and persistence of yaks. So popular yaks, you could upvote, and many of them got hundreds and hundreds of upvotes. If you posted a yak that got lots of upvotes, you gained a kind of currency called yakama, and it became a bit of a competition among Yik Yak users to get high amounts of yakama. But if you posted a yak that was not popular, it would be downvoted, and if a yak had more than 4 downvotes, it was completely deleted from the feed and from the system. And then this is what's essential to what I want to talk about this morning. It was anonymous. Initially, anyway, it was a completely anonymous app with no persistent identity. So I always try and put a bit of kind of Edinburgh eye candy on talks just to kind of persuade all of you to come up and visit us. So this is what Edinburgh looks like. And this is the kind of thing that Edinburgh university students were yakking about when they were on campus during 2014-15. There was lots of kind of playful stuff. Why would you go out in weather like this? Because, as you know, the weather in Edinburgh is often pretty bad. To go to a lecture that's going to be online anyway. My colleagues implementing lecture capture at Edinburgh will be happy to see that one. People would yak about missing lectures and tutorials because they were depressed, and they would genuinely seek advice and guidance from their peer group as to what the implications of missing things like seminars and tutorials might be. They would raise issues around personal support from their tutors, and occasionally they'd say something really nice about us. Quite occasionally. So we thought that this Edinburgh University and many kind of, I suppose, Russell Group type universities, often we get some quite harsh feedback in our national student survey results about the quality of our teaching, the quality of student experience, and that's something that we take really seriously. So we're looking at Yik Yak, we're thinking, actually, this feed can tell us what our students are really feeling about what we give them and what we offer them as a university. That it would be good to know more about what's going on in Yik Yak. So there was one kind of very pragmatic reason for doing some research in Yik Yak. There was also a kind of theoretical reason, which for me was about the way in which Yik Yak kind of created campus space. So, whereas most social media applications they're kind of building agnostic, aren't they? They link the whole campus kind of into a homogeneous kind of mass. Whereas Yik Yak, because of the hyperlocality of it, it enacted very tight campus communities. So, if you know Edinburgh University, you'll know that our vet school is positioned quite far out of town. It's the one right at the bottom of the map there at Easter Bush. And then our medical school is a bit closer in, but still fairly far out. And then we have our science campus, again, a little bit further in. And then we have our central campus, which is mostly humanities and social science. and then our education campus is somewhere else again. So we were seeing that in Yik Yak, we were getting really quite discipline-specific kind of communities emerging. We wanted to ask some kind of theoretical questions, really, about how the campus was enacted as a code space through the way that students were using Yik Yak. So we designed our research project, and this was in partnership with a fantastic research team of colleagues who I want to name check. So I worked with Nicola Osborne in our Information Services group, Louise Connolly in our vet school, and then Claire Grover and Richard Tobin in our School of Informatics. And we designed this killer mixed method research design. We used computational data to gather yaks that happened over a period of about 6 months within the campus, and we did a topic modelling of that. So we did participant observation. So we hired 2 fantastic undergraduate research assistants who they were in Yik Yak anyway, so we asked them to become participant observers of the yak community, gathering, coding yaks, and then writing reflective reports on them. And then we used data from our annual digital footprint survey, which Louise Connolly runs, and put that alongside some interviews with students who identified as active Yik Yak users. So it's a really good research design, if I say so myself. But then this was the problem we had. So I don't know if you can see that, yeah, you can. In 2014, Yik Yak was the 3rd most popular download in the iOS app chart. At the end of 2014, the company got a massive injection of venture capital fund, well, quite a massive, by venture capital standards, injection of funding. Our research project, which we scoped in February 2016, happened at this point. So you can see that Yik Yak was already on a decline when our research project started. It was losing popularity quite rapidly from its high point in 2014. So in August 2016, there was a redesign of Yik Yak, which I'll speak about a bit more in a minute, focused on this idea of making your world feel small again. So this was about the same time as the Brexit vote, so everything kind of converged into this vortex of depression, with Brexit, and then Yik Yak was also kind of working to this idea of closing borders. And then towards the end of that year, Yik Yak laid off 60% of its employees. So just to kind of track back a bit to August 2016, I think this is the point at which Yik Yak got something really wrong, and they kind of sounded the death knell for the app, really. So as I said, this was an anonymous app, and it was a hyperlocal app. And we had thought in designing our project that what we were most interested in was the hyperlocality of it. In fact, what was valuable in our students to the app was the anonymity. And the app developers made the same mistake. So in August 2016, they removed anonymity from the functioning of the app completely. And they made profiles and handles obligatory. And this is a little quote from one of the developers of the app. He said, since we've always been focused on the hyperlocal, anonymity was just a way of getting people into the app. So we've got rid of that, and now we're focused on college campuses and really nailing where these local interactions are taking place. So, there was lots of publicity about how I found my best friend on Yik Yak, and it shifted from what it was doing previously, which functioned as a very sort of lively, kind of quite gritty, anonymous space, to becoming a place where people could find friends. So when our students got back in September 2016, this is the kind of stuff that they were yakking about. There was a kind of upsurge of kind of, despair, really, among the Yik Yak users that the developers had completely removed anonymity from the functioning of the app. The feed dropped dramatically, as I'll show you in a minute. So in November, the developers, you see how tired they look in this photograph. This is the two developers of Yik Yak. They released a video saying, we have done a U-turn, and we've decided that actually we messed this one up. We're bringing anonymity back to Yik Yak. Sweet Delicious Anonymity was a yak from one of our local students at this kind of U-turn in developer policy. And then there was all kinds of kind of celebration, I guess, among the Yik Yak community about the return of anonymity, and all kinds of jokes. It happened around the same time as the Trump election. But the data that we had from our research shows really interestingly what happened when that anonymity was removed from the application. In September when students returned to university, you could see there was, the usage dropped massively. And then as soon as they brought the anonymity back in November, it went up again. Having said that, you have to bear in mind that this was within the context of, globally, quite a severe drop in Yik Yak usage. The growth of the app was slowing off for sure, and I'm going to return to this point later on. So our students were really happy that anonymity was back. Someone said it was the first non-shit thing to happen in 2016. And they were the one on the right, they were thanking the developers for bringing the anonymity back. And this is like a typical, at Edinburgh, this was a typical kind of yak. Does anyone want a morning cuddle? But then on the 6th of May 2017, the app closed completely. It was removed from the App Store and ceased functioning. So this was an application that was valued at $400 million a few years ago and then sold for $1 million earlier this year. So you think there would be an upsurge of kind of regret and so on from the Yik Yak community, but there wasn't really. So one of our project research associates wrote that the students didn't really care. None of the student-focused websites were discussing it. None of the people she spoke to really knew about the closure and wouldn't care about it either. And in one respect, I think we'd probably all say, well, Yik Yak wasn't a great loss for lots of reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. But I think there are things that we should care about not about Yik Yak closing in particular, it's another startup that failed, but about some of the things that Yik Yak did for and with our students. And I'm going to focus my analysis of this on these three kind of constellations of value, if you like, the value of evidence, anonymity and resistance. Evidence for what and resistance to what will become clear as I speak, I hope. So the first point I want to touch on is the value of evidence. And my key point here really is that research suggests that Yik Yak chat was more benign than toxic. But most of us know about Yik Yak because of the toxicity that happened on the platform that was widely reported in the news media and the blogosphere. And there was some really unpleasant stuff happened on Yik Yak, and no one would deny that. There were bomb threats, there was victimization, there were arrests, there was harassment of women, there were death threats, there were racist death threats. Some colleges moved to ban Yik Yak because they were lobbied by their students to do so. It was disabled in many places. One group at Mary Washington brought a lawsuit against their university for not protecting them from Yik Yak victimization, and the app itself was quite heavily criticized for not revealing the identities of some of the people that were perpetuating harassment and hate speech on the app. So there was some really serious stuff that happened around this app, particularly in the US. And just to put into context what I want to go on to say, this stuff was serious, it was devastating for the victims, and we know that cyberbullying online is a really big deal. 40% of students in higher education have witnessed online cyberbullying in their social media networks. Having said that, I think it's also helpful to look at what the app developers did to try to kind of deal with these allegations of enabling hate speech to happen. And they did a lot more than many of our other social networks do. So when they tagged the app in the Yak Store as for 17s and overs, which enabled parents to set up the usual safety measures so younger children couldn't download it. So that's something. And then when it became clear that students in high schools were using it as a bullying platform, they set up a facility to geofence schools, so that basically if you try to access Yik Yak from within a school, it wouldn't allow it. And in doing that, they shut out a very substantial proportion of their users from the network, which I'm not sure that any other social media app has shown any willingness to do. They had very clear rules about you don't bully or specifically target other yakkers, which you had to agree to on sign-up. And then latterly, they set up a system of word filtering. So if you yapped something like, including a word like bomb or something, then you would get a kind of pump the brakes message. So they did really quite a lot, and more than most other social media apps did to try and limit the potential for victimization and hate. Obviously, none of those techniques would be 100% successful, but they tried. Most importantly, the community moderation aspect of Yik Yak seemed to function really well in most instances. So there was a report led by Savesky, looked at nearly 2 million yaks across US campuses and produced these word clouds showing the 100 most characteristic words for upvoted yaks on the left and downvoted yaks on the right. And you can see that it's the kind of the offensive ones which should be very rapidly downvoted. That data is really hard to get because in our research study, offensive yaks were downvoted so quickly it became difficult to gather them. So it showed that the community moderation was working pretty well. Another smaller study said that there is some sort of racist and distasteful, sexist stuff on Yik Yak, but it's not so substantial as to call for a demonization of the entire application. And Savesky, this is the study that did the kind of really big 2 million yak analysis, kind of said the same thing. There were, on general, positive social norms emerging through Yik Yak. So we did I don't normally like word clouds much because they're a bit kind of a blunt instrument, but this one is actually a word cloud showing the most popular words in the whole corpus of yaks that we gathered at Edinburgh, the whole kind of, the whole lot of them. And you can see just from a quick look, unless you're queasy about a little bit of everyday swearing, you can see that generally what people were talking about was quite socially oriented, quite space and place oriented, certainly not notably offensive. So when we we put together a kind of a database of kind of swear words and offensive words using existing corpuses, and ran our yak corpus compared it with our yak corpus, and we found that less than 2% of the yaks that we had in our data actually related to words in that database of offensive words. So just the little green portion of the donut. So that when we did a topic analysis of this work, we found that these are the kinds of things that students were mostly yakking about. They were talking about student life, what club did you go to last night, what are you watching, what are you reading. They talked a bit about academic issues, not as much as we thought they would be. They talked a lot about sex and dating, they talked quite a lot about politics and gender. And they also, because this was running during the period when Yik Yak was going back and forth with anonymity, they talked a lot about anonymity as well. So this kind of finding that actually what was going on Yik Yak, at Edinburgh at least, wasn't really offensive stuff, was backed up by our student research associates, who said there was a general feeling that people read and respond to posts with empathy and understanding. These were supportive, they were kind. It was generally a kind, funny, empathetic community. Amanda Hess, who writes for Slate, published a couple of really nice articles in defence of Yik Yak, talking about, well, if we ban every network where harassment and abuse occurs, we'd have to not only ban all social media, we'd have to ban homes, college campuses themselves. So I think what I took from our research was that we need to have the conversation about cyberbullying and victimization. Of course, we do in relation to social media, but we also need to have a broader discussion about anonymity on campus and the function of it for our students. So this is what I'm going to go on to talk about next. My second kind of value proposition, I suppose, is around the value of anonymity itself. There's been a kind of upsurge in research into anonymity, sort of, I would say, anonymity studies-oriented research in the last few years. And I think it's clearly in response to the ways in which internet use has kind of designed out, or according to some theorists, killed the potential and possibility for anonymity. So I'd recommend to you, if you want to read a bit more about anonymity, this special issue of Ephemera. So I tweeted the references to this talk this morning, so if someone has retweeted them, great, you can link to them directly from that document. But this essay that Bachman and colleagues write talks about how anonymity can help us fight surveillance, which is something I'll come on to next, but it can also enable particular forms of equality or certain kinds of speaking out to happen. Online disinhibition doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be toxic, but it can also be benign. And this was certainly the case at Edinburgh. We were finding that students were using Yik Yak to do really important work in terms of support from their peer networks. For example, asking about when exam results were coming out, asking about whether it's normal to get a 2-2, and talking a lot, in fact, about mental health, which we know, again, is an issue for our students. This was raised a lot on Yik Yak, and in the Edinburgh context, the responses to this were almost always supportive. So the BBC kind of hooks onto the idea of Yik Yak being a useful way to reach this kind of demographic, this young demographic of young adults quite early. And they ran some really interesting chat events using Yik Yak. One to kind of talk to people about Brexit, and they found out as they did that a lot of young people didn't even know what Brexit was. But they also ran a really nice campaign a kind of discussion forum with Yik Yak around the Canada election, and ran a session specifically on mental health with young people as well. So that I think the BBC were quite switched on to the kind of benefits of using an anonymous environment for this kind of talk. So my feeling here is that we have to move beyond this sense that if something is secret, if it's anonymous, it's somehow deviant. And I think this is where a lot of research into anonymity studies is going at the moment. It's starting to question how we define and how we work with anonymity, particularly in the context of online, though not entirely. So I like this phrase from a recent paper from Angus Bancroft, who says that we talk about anonymity as though it's a withdrawal from the social, but actually it's through a form of social engagement. Lots of people have tried to kind of redefine what constitutes anonymity, and this is my favourite one, this idea that it's a constellation of partial unknowability, invisibility and untrackability. We know that total anonymity is almost impossible online. But this is my favourite kind of quote about the potential and about what anonymity actually is, and it's from an old paper from Helen Nissenbaum, where she says, the value of anonymity lies not in the capacity to be unnamed, but in the possibility of acting or participating while remaining out of reach, remaining unreachable. So being unreachable means that no one's going to come knocking on your door demanding explanations. So I suspect all of us kind of can think about moments when we have wanted to be unreachable, or times at which unreachability would be a kind of socially valuable thing. And I think by thinking a bit about other social media environments, we can get some more kind of insight into this value of unreachability. So thinking about Facebook, people have written about the compulsory visibility of the branded self in Facebook. We all do it, don't we? We say, look, here's my child, here's my job, here's my life. Isn't it fantastic? We can very carefully craft and curate and brand ourselves for representation on social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And we found that this was very much the case with our students as well. Not only that they did this branding of the self, but also that it was more or less compulsory to be on Facebook to function socially at our university. One of our interview respondents said, well, if you didn't have it, you were just kind of a bit annoying, because you couldn't link into any of our kind of study groups or events or anything. Almost all the blue bit of the donut were people who were engaged with Facebook either actively or as consumers. Facebook is a more or less compulsory social media environment for many of us, including our students. It's also, as an article in the London Review of Books said last week, it's the biggest surveillance-based enterprise in the history of mankind. As this John Lanchester article, I'd really recommend it to you if you've got 20 minutes for a long read. He talks about how Facebook knows more about you than the most intrusive government has ever known about its citizens. It watches you, it profiles you, it extracts data about you, and then it uses that behaviour to sell advertising. He describes what Facebook does with its surveillance data as pathetic, which means it's kind of a bit disappointing. So I think with Facebook, there's what I like to think of as a kind of hideous paradox, right? So on the surface of it, we're all crafting ourselves minutely. We're exercising a massive level of control over how we look online, what we talk about, how we talk about our activities on Facebook, and we're building this branded self. But behind the scenes, Facebook is gathering, extracting, profiling, selling on a data double of us over which we have absolutely no control at all. It's disturbing, and I think public awareness of this has grown hugely over the last year or so. So my point here in relation to Yik Yak is that Yik Yak, although it's by far was by far not a perfect space. It did provide a kind of alternative to this kind of this branding that has to go on Facebook and other mainstream social media platforms. Yeah, okay. I also just want to take a brief aside to recognise how funny Yik Yak was, and and how important humour can be to community building. So we found in our research that most of the upvoted yaks, or the most upvoted yaks, were almost always funny ones. I particularly like the one about the text from the orthodontist. I think we probably all benefit from understanding how to cite straight out of my ass in Harvard format. So, Yik Yak was funny. That a little aside before we get into even more of the depressing stuff. So why should we care? Point 3, and the last reason that I'm going to talk about why we should care is the value of resistance. And it touches on the point I just made about Facebook's surveillance methods. Nick Switchenek's book on platform capitalism is another strong recommendation. He talks about how data is the new oil. We've all heard this said many times. In the 21st century, advanced capitalism depends on the ability of companies to extract and use data, our personal data. And I think, returning back to Yik Yak, this was really the problem for Yik Yak. I've put up here a little shot from the VentureBeat blog, which blogs on kind of business models for social media and technology firms. So, and I found this a really interesting article. It's about what we can learn from the death of Yik Yak. He said, well, he says what I just said, which is that the declining growth should have been a clear warning. The developers should have understood that anonymity was a key component of the app. By missing and failing to build an understanding of its user base, it missed the opportunity to eventually build a viable business model around the app. We know that growth before profit has been the standard business model for social media firms. Yik Yak very much had the growth. It never really dealt with the need to monetize and therefore to develop a viable business model through the use and extraction of personal data, which is usually how platforms monetize. So the Bachman article on the kind of social productivity of anonymity that I talked about earlier made this point that extracting data from our social life, transforming it into a commodity, is a capture of what was once a common good. However, online anonymity is a severe obstacle for those who operate in the data extraction, data analysis, and data trade business. So anonymous apps are always going to find it harder to build business models, I suspect, from their data. Not that it's impossible, but it's harder. So one conclusion, although it's not one of my stated conclusions, is that there's a kind of structural issue going on here. If platform capitalism structures out anonymity, in that anonymity makes it much harder for them to use and to gather and use personal data, then the kind of moral panic that we see frequently around anonymous apps, and we saw very much in the context of Yik Yak, is to an extent doing the work of platform capitalism by building a resistance to supporting the development and use of anonymous social media. Okay, so to start to conclude, this is my first conclusion. I think that in designing our next digital learning environments, we need to leave some space for unnameability, for ephemerality. I think we need to learn and develop new ways of having conversations about anonymity within universities, and importantly, for those of us working within educational technology and digital education, look for ways in which we can actually build unreachability spaces for students and build clever new ways to manage and moderate those spaces so as to reduce some of the negative aspects of online disinhibition and to build on some of the amazing community kind of humorous and peer support networks that can happen in those spaces. So I've been really interested to read the recent blogging that Anne-Marie Scott, who's a colleague of mine at Edinburgh, has been doing around this idea. I thinking about she's been using Hakim Bey's temporary autonomous zones idea to think about how do we build in ephemera by design? How do we build in simple pop-up tools that gather minimal data and then delete themselves? If that makes you think of Snapchat, you might be interested to know that Snapchat has grown. We know this because of the work that Louise Connolly at Edinburgh does on the digital footprint survey every year. We know that Snapchat use at the university has grown as Yik Yak has declined. This is one of my favourite quotes in this kind of, probably this presentation. Benjamin Haber said in a recent article, to be ephemeral isn't to disappear, it's to preserve communities without turning them into data. And I think we need to look at ways in which we do that in the context of learning technology. My second conclusion relates to these issues that I've been discussing around platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism, and so on. This is one of my favourite quotes. I'll read it out in full. Shoshana Zuboff wrote a couple of years ago, powerful felt needs for effective life vie against the inclination to resist the surveillance project. As with Facebook, you kind of effectively need Facebook to live an effective life in many social contexts. So she says, this conflict produces a kind of psychic numbing that inures people to the realities of being tracked, passed, mined and modified, or disposes them to rationalise the situation in resigned cynicism. We've all done it, haven't we? We've all clicked the terms and conditions, or we've all allowed the app to access our other apps in the interests of living an effective life and saying, oh, well, they'll get all my data anyway. I do it all the time myself. I think I've rarely read a passage in a paper which has made me feel more clearly that there's an educational project here. And I think in this sense, as educators, we need to think about psychic numbing and working against psychic numbing as an educational project, something that we can focus and design our teaching around in this kind of age of surveillance capitalism. So this is my second conclusion. In designing our teaching, can we let it actively educate against the psychic numbing on which surveillance capitalism depends? Thinking about how we might do that is a whole other lecture. Hearteningly, there's been a lot of very smart people blogging and writing about this very issue over the last summer, and I've just put a few of them up here, and the link to their blog post and their work is on the document that's hopefully going around on Twitter. So reading some of Amy Collier, Chris Gilliard, Jim Grimm, Jeremy Knox, Jen Ross and Ben Williamson's work helps us to understand how we might begin to actually design in resistance to psychic numbing to our teaching. So on that note, I am going to finish with a summary of my conclusions, an image attribution, and another link to the links and references page if you're not seeing it on Twitter. Thank you very much for listening. I think we have plenty of time for questions. So I think Helen's going to come up and share the questions.
Thanks very much, Siân. I see a lot of kind of parallels with Bonnie's talk yesterday for those of us that were here. The interesting thing for me is a keynote that finishes ahead of time as well. I think that's a rarity in itself. So, any questions?
Thanks, Siân. Mark Johnson, University of Liverpool. I was thinking about identity as you were talking, and this sort of tension, I think, between identity and anonymity. And there's something very fundamental that happens in higher education, or you hope should happen, which is that people come through the process and have a clearer sense of who they are, and a clearer sense of professing who they are to the outside world. And I don't know, I worry about anonymity in the sense that there's this sense of, a student can come out of the process and say, yes, this is who I am, this may be who I'm not, this is also who I am, but I don't want you to know about it. And I think there's a certain need and a responsibility to inspect some of that stuff, because some of those people become quite powerful, of course.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I would certainly agree that the end point of education should be a critical, confident citizen who's able to stand up and say, here I am, and this is what I believe, and this is why, and that should be our educational aim. But I think the process of getting to that point is not easy. And I think that what anonymity can do is open up spaces where the pressures are less, where the declaration of who you are and why you're saying what you're saying are less intense, and that in itself can be a useful kind of learning moment. It can provide a useful learning community. So I completely agree with you, but I think we need to think about the ways in which we get to that point. Yeah.
Hi, Frances Bell. That was a great talk, Siân. I'm talking about some similar things tomorrow, but you know, it's just going to be the poor relation of that talk, but you covered all the good ground for me. Anyway, I think anonymity is really interesting, but what I was curious about in listening to what you were saying was the intersection between anonymity and the up-down vote. So I'm thinking about, I remember reading an article by David Banks about what happens on Reddit and the sort of sexism and racism that happens there, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how the up-down voting intersected with anonymity.
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure whether it intersected with anonymity exactly, but it did make community moderation of anonymous communications very easy. And I think that the way that they designed community moderation into Yik Yak was done really quite well. I don't think we're still trying to develop mechanisms for proper community moderation on social media, aren't we? And I think we need all the kind of good examples we can get. So I think the easiness and the kind of finality of the way in which anything downvoted 4 times would be deleted from the system was a good model. And I think in terms of relating it to anonymity, I suppose that the effectiveness and efficiency of that method of downvoting did stop people abusing the power of anonymity, at least in the context that I was researching, although I accept not in every context.
Well, I don't know about Yik Yak because I've never seen it, but up-down voting isn't universally a good tool. It's killed comments on YouTube, so you know, it's pretty tricky really, isn't it?
It is difficult, and I think we have to be quite fine-grained about how we think about this, because different mechanisms will work with different communities. I don't think there's any single answer, because social media is about a community as well as being about a technical application development. So we have to think about how the technology and the people are designed in together, and so it's difficult. Yeah.
Anyone? Sheila?
I think this is the question rule. Thanks again, Siân, that was great. What I'm thinking about just now is some of the things that Bon mentioned in her keynote yesterday, when we were talking about in relation to openness and resistance, and this kind of paradox now for me in terms of openness and anonymity, and how can we combine them both, or do you think that they are kind of separate things? You know, am I more powerful if I'm anonymous, but if as an open educator I want to share what I'm doing as well, so I don't want to be anonymous in that context? Sorry, this is probably not making much sense, but I think that there is something there. I'm not quite sure how we take that forward in terms of how we teach and how we live, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, my take on that would be that, and actually I'm not sure that the open movement talks enough about this, is the way that power circulates within the open movement. So when a powerful person within the open education movement, for example, makes a post, a lot of people will read it. There's a powerful position to be in. For people who are new to that community and that mode of practice, being open can be very stressful. And so I think anonymity gives a certain amount of protection actually to the most vulnerable in some regards, in relation to openness. Yeah, that would be my response to that.
Lady at the front.
Thanks, Siân, that was great. Just to kind of pick up a bit on the point that Sheila made there, I think there's something really interesting as well about the interface between anonymity and the digital footprint. And for those who are not aware, the Digital Footprint initiative is an initiative that's been running in Edinburgh for a number of years now to educate students in the profile, the digital footprint they leave behind. And that's an idea that I feel slightly uneasy about sometimes, because I think it can kind of edge into self-censorship a little bit. And we talk a lot about how we curate our identity and who decides what is appropriate and not appropriate in different environments. And I think there's some quite thorny stuff in there about what you choose to reveal and what you choose to hide. And I think anonymity's got a really interesting central role there. And I think there's quite often a tension between these things.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a difficult one for us in education because, like you say, we want to educate students to manage their digital footprint. But by doing that, we're doing some of the work around the critiques of platform capitalism have raised around the branded self, the presentation of self, often for employability purposes. But I think the other thing that might be a useful kind of thing to think with in this context is the idea of social cooling. This idea that we are less, when we know that we're being watched, when we know that everything is globally, immediately accessible, we tend to self-censor. And that can mean that that heated debates, contentious debates, difficult stuff often doesn't get raised. So we all know this. We all end up in our kind of bland filter bubbles. So I agree it's a tension, but I think it's one that universities have to start to think about how we deal with.
I agree.
Did you want to make a follow-on?
No, I think it is. It's a difficult issue, and I think it's something that we just need to continually negotiate rather than sort of say, you must always curate what you do, because I think sometimes actually, if you do let your streams cross, is it really the end of the world? And who makes these value judgments about what is kind of like morally right and wrong in different situations and different professions as well? So I think it's just something that does need constant negotiation.
Agreed.
Anyone else? From the non-question side, maybe? At the back? Sorry, Maren, or Joe, it's a little bit of a walk. Go for it.
Siân, as we're waiting for the mic just for a second, I'm curious if you had any more comments on the employability aspect that you mentioned. At this conference, we're talking a lot about assessment and accreditation, particularly sort of formative, summative, the differences, and a lot of the digital footprint can count towards that. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the drawbacks of trying to make everything valuable for a future employer, and of having that kind of pressure to brand yourself, as you put it?
I just think students need a bit of space from employability agendas, to be honest. I mean, I think, yes, employability is important to our students and it's important to our universities as well, but that's not all that higher education is about. So higher education should be doing other things as well. And one of the things it might be doing would be enabling different kinds of data citizenship to emerge. And one of the ways in which they might do that might be through anonymous, ephemeral spaces. So I think my answer would be it's not about, we can't think about employability as the be-all and end-all of higher education.
Question from the back?
Siân, I wasn't sure because I can't see from this far back, but did the Yik Yak participants have pseudonyms?
No, when the app first emerged, you didn't have to have any kind of handle. As they started to sort of tinker with the anonymity, they introduced the ability to include handles, pseudonyms, to yaks. But for most of the time that the app was very popular, no.
Yeah, because I was just thinking that there's, once you introduce pseudonymity, then there is a kind of a trace between this was the same person who posted this, that, and the other thing, and so that boundary becomes a bit blurred, but there, perhaps pseudonymity is a way to sort of bridge the gap between complete anonymity and identity building or branding.
Yeah, it could be, and I suspect that was part of what the app developers must have thought. They must have thought, let's introduce handles and let's enable people to make persistent connections with each other through the app. But in this context, it was completely the wrong decision. So again, it's going to depend on context. Sometimes pseudo-anonymity will be a really good idea. In this case, I don't think it was.
Aaron?
Thanks. Rob Farrow, Open University. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I'm just sort of looking at your kind of two conclusions, and I think that this is all very timely, and I like the angle that you're kind of taking with it. But I also think the direction of travel is very much towards surveillance, analytics, and actually management information. And I think that the interventions that you've kind of identified here, how to proceed, are good ones. But the bigger one to me is, well, how do you convince the managers of educational institutions not to double down on this stuff and go further and further into things like blockchain and stuff like that, where you would have this, no ephemerality at all. It's all this a very sort of concrete sequence of data that's been collected about you in the past. So what's your take on kind of institutional strategies for this stuff?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is have the conversation, which I think hopefully this is part of doing that. But I agree. I mean, in terms of the amount of conversations that are happening around learning analytics, the amount of conversations that are happening about anonymity are minuscule. I do think that's changing. I have sensed over the last year that there has been a real kind of upsurge, not only in academic research in this area, but in public awareness and the desire to have the conversation about anonymity and data protection. Stuff that seemed really boring previously now seems to be at the top of people's minds. So I do think things are changing. In terms of management of universities, I think we need events where we talk about student social media ecologies, we talk about the value of different kinds of nameability and unnameability, and we balance the advantages of learning analytics against some of the advantages of other ways of understanding our students as data citizens. So at the moment I feel it's about conversations, but I agree, I think it's a really good point. It's not the direction of travel, not yet.
Anyone else? Sian's still got 10 minutes to earn a keep yet, so we're okay for a minute. Oh, joking. The lady in the middle, the pink.
One of the things, I've been involved in a number of communities over the years, Helen Whitehead from Nottingham, and profiles have seemed a great way for people to get to know each other and to form communities. But you're saying, as you're saying, there are loads of different problems with that now. And even with our VLEs, to what extent do we allow people to see each other's information? Is there any change in that area? Does it matter whether you can see when somebody last logged on? At what point does it become data that's private and personal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think VLEs have always been surveillance machines, haven't they? It's always been very easy to click through to data from our VLE about our students that we would, 15 years ago, we've never expected to have comparable data on our on-campus students. So that has always been built in and embedded within the functioning of those VLEs and LMSs. So I think, again, it's just about shifting that conversation. I mean, most VLEs, I'm saying this tentatively because I know that the one that we use at Edinburgh does have a function for anonymous discussion, but it's barely known about and barely used. So there could be some quite easy ways to experiment with anonymity kind of with student groups, just using existing VLEs. The underlying kind of anonymity would be quite minimal, be very easy to identify those students, I should imagine. But at the social level, it would be possible to do some quite light touch kind of work with students on that, using what we've got.
Okay, I think we'll finish it. I've just got one observation, just wanted to kind of pick up on that when you had the word clouds up and you were kind of looking at the kind of the common stuff that students were talking about, the kind of the social nature and that kind of the fragile nature of the students, that they need that anonymity to talk about the kind of the serious issues that are affecting them that they don't talk about with anyone else. And kind of particularly for students in that transition to higher education, they're coming in that they don't want to kind of, well, it's the embarrassment, isn't it? They don't want that. And they need that safe space to kind of be able to talk about these sorts of things that we don't necessarily take for granted, but as academics or as tutors, professional service staff, we might not necessarily realise the importance of that kind of space for the students. I mean, it's not necessarily a question, but it's just something I've kind of taken from it.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting yaks we had was during the period where remove the anonymity. Someone yacked, what's happened? I need some anonymous help right now. You know, and I think that was a really telling yak that there is a need for this.
Yeah.
So yeah, good point.
Okay, so can we just have one more round of applause for Siân? Thank you very much. And just to show our thanks, we just have a little token of appreciation for Siân.
Thank you very much.